I'm Leah Renee, a stand-up comedian in Philadelphia. I interview guests from around the world, talk about the creative process, the perils of modern living, offer insights from books I'm reading, jokes I'm writing, my Mormon past, and topics that are too eggy to take to the stage. I hope you enjoy the Leah Renee podcast.
And it starts right now.
All right, let's get into it. Today's book is Bill Bryson's A Walk in the Woods. I had not planned on getting this. I did no research. I went into this blindly. I found a copy for $1 at a thrift store, so I decided to take a punt because I know that I've liked Bryson's stuff in the past. I was happy to learn that this book is about his walk along the Appalachian Trail, or as they say in the actual area, Appalachian. I happen to know this because I used to live along the Appalachian Trail. For the purposes of brevity, I will just call it the AT. That is what it's known as. So I don't have to debate if I want to say it the Southern way or the Yankee way. Only about a quarter of people who start the AT actually finish it. It is a grueling hike. It was fun to read this book because he was hiking the AT exactly 30 years ago from when I was reading it. It kind of put me in that space to imagine him there, and yet so much has changed since his hike. For example, when Bryson hiked it, about 1,000 people were through hikers, meaning they started at one end of the trail and walked all the way to completion. At that time, there was some debate on how long the AT was. Bryson at the time put it at about 2,100 miles, but I've since looked it up. It's 2,198 miles, so almost 2,200 miles of hiking. And so many of those miles are up steep inclines. One of the craziest things that I learned about the Appalachian Trail is that the whole trail, all combined, is about 464,000 feet of climbing. And I know it's probably hard to visualize that, but that is 16 times the climb of Mount Everest across the entire trail. So only about a quarter of people who start the AT actually finish it. Especially if you start from the bottom and work your way up, it means that Maine is the last state that you go through. Maine is brutal. It's so hard. If you're into statistics, the climbs that you go through in Maine is about 66,000 feet. So let's compare it to Mount Everest again. Mount Everest is 29,000 feet-ish. So just going through the Appalachian Trail through Maine is like climbing Everest twice. So 3/4 of people drop out. I have done some portions of the AT, the Virginia part, and it was lovely to read this summertime book, thinking about being in the woods while being nestled into my cozy, air-conditioned Philadelphia home. I really enjoy walking books. In fact, one that I was required to read for a wilderness survival class that I took was called The Long Walk by Sławomir Rawicz. Such a fascinating book. I don't even want to do the research to find out if anything in there has been proven a fabrication because it was such an incredible book. This is about a Polish prisoner of war who walks from Siberia to Nepal with 3 other people. It is an insane book, and I've always liked that kind of, what would you call it? Survival horror or porn, or people use porn a lot. People are pretty fast and loose with the word porn and just tacking it onto the end of things like food porn or disaster porn. But I've always loved stories of people pushing themselves to their physical limits. There's something about learning that human beings can push themselves to a certain point that maybe as I think about the potential for a Mad Max hellscape in my own lifetime, I think, well, they did it, I can do it. I think maybe it also helps me tackle the fear of one day being homeless. When you read stories about people who, in some cases, chose to be homeless and learned to love it and embrace it, A few years ago, I read The Salt Path, which is a story of a woman who actually found herself homeless. And when faced with the decision of living in council housing or just living alongside the English coastal path, she chose the latter. It was a really fascinating book, and she really shed light on the societal imperative that we have to do more about the housing crisis. She provides some very interesting statistics about sleeping rough, as they call it in the UK, and in a show don't tell kind of way uncovers the biases that we have toward people who have lost their homes. In her case, through no fault of her own. She rented property from a friend of hers for years and years, and then her friend decided to sell the property or something happened, but she had invested her whole life into this place. She had a farm there, and all of a sudden she was without a home, and most of the income that she made and the way that she survived was sort of living off the land that she had. And so when that was gone, she found herself homeless and not completely penniless, but in this kind of limbo state. And the idea of living in cramped government housing just felt awful to her because she was so connected with the earth and being outside. She decided to live on the trail. It was really interesting as she would recount conversations that she had with strangers because she was older. I think she's maybe in her 50s or so when this happened. And when she was out hiking, people would applaud her of, wow, this is great that you're out here doing it. So when people thought that she was just an ambitious woman wanting to hike, they were really supportive and friendly. But when she mentioned she lost her house and this was sort of the only life she could afford, they kind of turned on her. Like, it's noble to hike if you actually have a house, but if you're just living outside, then what kind of freak are you? It was really, really interesting. This book got me in the mood to read more travel, adventure, walking kind of books. So I'm planning to read some about the Camino. There's one called Off the Road by Jack Hitt and another called The Pilgrimage to Santiago by Edward Mullen. So I'm considering adding those to the queue because I've complained about this before. I love my kids, but boy, when I read The Salt Path, I thought, oh, this actually sounds really good. I couldn't haul 3 kids around with me on that. So the ability to live nomadically and go for long walks, as grueling and as difficult as they may be, is somewhat of a luxury or an imposed hardship for the childless. In fact, maybe I'll talk about her at the end. As I was researching this book, I found out about Emma Gatewood, also known as Grandma Gatewood. Bryson touches on her story a bit during his book, but I did some more research and found out the first woman to hike the AT solo was Emma Gatewood, and she did it when she was 67 years old, and she did it in 1955. And here's where it comes back to having kids. Okay, Grandma Gatewood, as she was known, had 11 kids. I learned that all of them were out of the house by 1951, and 3 years later, she was out on the trails. I hard relate to you, Emma Gatewood. I feel I need to reiterate that I do love my children, but I am counting the days because I love these walking people. I love just wandering around, eating whatever you find. Like, why am I a migratory animal? I don't know, but these books really scratch an itch for me, which is what you would be doing on the AT because there are so many ticks and mosquitoes and bugs, which leads me to the reason why I am interested in Camino books and doing the Camino, because I gotta say, I think hiking in Europe is so much better than hiking in the United States. There are so many perils along the trail that you would find from the south to the north. And then you compare that with England, where there's like nothing that can hurt you. Even the fact that there's less guns in Europe makes it feel safer to hike over there than over here. So this book was helpful because I have an admiration for Europe as being older and cooler, but some of the stuff that you learn about the Appalachian Trail is pretty bad. Bryson goes into some of the statistics about how old the forests are, how many different plant and animal species, all these very unique and ancient tree species. It's really pretty astounding. Another thing Bryson talks a lot about is climate change and conservation efforts. And again, this was 30 years ago, so it was very interesting to read some of his predictions and then to see if he was right or wrong about them. So I did some fact checking and found that it was mixed. There was definitely a doomsday kind of feeling about things like acid rain, which I actually don't really hear people talking about acid rain that much anymore. But I remember as a kid hearing a lot about acid rain. I can just go through some of the pros and cons. One thing he was worried about was the American chestnut and that they weren't doing enough to protect their population. I found out it is now an active restoration and they have been genetically engineering trees that can survive this specific blight that has been taking out the American chestnut. Also, Fraser firs that he was worried about have tripled since the 80s, so that's a species that's doing well. Hemlocks, on the other hand, have not done so well. There was some kind of fungus that was traveling along the trail from the north and apparently now has removed 90% of the hemlocks along the Appalachian Trail. In fact, the AT has lost a quarter of its cover because of this fungus thing. It's hard to imagine the scale of that, 4 billion. I think it's really difficult for us to tell the difference between a million and a billion because we hear it thrown around so often. To give you context, a million seconds is 11 and a half days. Do you know how many days a billion seconds is? 31.7 years. So that's a massive decline in tree population, which is very sad. Obviously, this has affected a lot of things, including the songbird decline that fell 50% between the 40s and the 80s. And Bryson gives a lot of fascinating tidbits about attitudes towards wildlife and preservation. And there have always been people who wanted to study nature and protect it, and others who want to profit from it. He talks a little bit about the logging industry and shares this statistic, which was crazy to me, about the paved roads around the national parks, which they largely use these roads for the purposes of mining, even though it seems like such a great idea to have roads so that the wilderness is more accessible by hikers. No, it's so people could cut things down. There are 378,000 miles of national forest roads, which is 8 times the amount of interstate highways. Isn't that insane? I know this sounds very doom and gloom, but there have actually been several things that have improved since Bryson took his hike 30 years ago. One story that he mentioned when he was in the Great Smoky Mountains was that from the apex of a certain mountain, the visibility was only 9 miles. As of today, the visibility is more than 65 miles. I don't totally understand how the human eye works and how far that we can see, but apparently the natural state of the air quality would allow for 120 miles. So we're halfway there. I mean, that's a huge difference. Only being able to see 9 miles and then a jump to 65. Also, the acid rain that he spoke so frequently of is on the decline thanks to the Clean Air Act. I really like these stories because it feels like we're just on this speed train with no brakes, about to plunge into a ravine. But we've had some pretty significant victories. I'm not sure how many of you had this as a kid, but they talked a lot about the ozone layer. Do you remember that? I remember joking that there was a hole in the ozone above my sister's head because she would spray so much Aquanet, which is an old 80s hairspray. So yeah, do y'all remember that? When it was like the ozone layer, we kept hearing about how in Australia people would go outside for 15 minutes and they would have a massive sunburn because there was a hole in the ozone. I wondered about that a few years ago because I don't really hear people talking about the ozone layer. But what's great is it's actively healing because of something called the Montreal Protocol, and they banned CFCs. Isn't that crazy? We saw a problem. We were like, oh no, this is destroying our planet. Let's change course. We did, and then it worked. So if you don't know what CFCs are, it's called like chlorofluorocarbons. And they use them as a coolant in fridges. They used to have them in the air conditioning units in cars, but they stopped doing that in the 90s. The joke about the hairspray, that's because CFCs were in hairspray and spray paint, even asthma inhalers. It's some kind of, I don't know, propellant or something. It was used as a cleaning agent. Dry cleaners would use it, and you'd use it to clean industrial equipment and things like that. But yeah, once we found out it was doing active harm, we banned it, and the ozone layer is set to heal by 2040. 2040 is kind of soon. So that's, I think, the one that the hole in the ozone layer that affects where most people live. I think it has also thinned out in the Arctic, and that one is like 2045. But that's what I'm saying. I was tempted to read Bryson's book and think, oh man, if it's so bad in the 90s, it must be terrible now. But some things have really improved. Now, I think people are afraid to say that things have gotten better because we don't want to rest on our laurels. And I'm sure someone well-versed in climate change could come and rattle off a lot of very scary statistics about how we shouldn't be whistling Dixie just because the ozone layer has improved, because we've lost most of our coral reefs and the Amazon and the ice caps melting and all of that. I don't mean to downplay that. I simply wanted to highlight the exciting news that we can make a difference and shift course. In fact, I grew up with this idea that we're always inching toward somewhat of a dystopian industrial complex, that so many movies about the future, nature has been mowed down and everything is like a Blade Runner cityscape. But it's interesting to note that some places that were starting to become industrialized shut down and nature has reclaimed it. And Bryson talks about this on the trail of hillside communities that used to exist that eventually left, and specifically the Delaware Water Gap, which is actually fairly close to where I live on the Pennsylvania-New Jersey border. There used to be these huge turn-of-the-century hotels in the Poconos, and then eventually tourists started wanting to go other places, and these cool, big, grand Victorian hotels were just shut down, abandoned, and burned for insurance money, which is crazy. I'm not saying that I think we should have big hotels all along the Appalachian Trail, but I was really inspired by someone named Benton MacKaye, who was the one who first proposed the Appalachian Trail. This was shortly after World War I, and you had a lot of disillusioned, shell-shocked, impoverished people living in dirty, crowded cities. And MacKaye imagined the Appalachian Trail not so much as a hiking path, but almost like a cluster, a network of hamlets where people could escape the hectic and destructive tenets of urban life. I'm not sure if he called himself a socialist or if maybe that's a title someone would have given him in retrospect, but he was very much against the economic scramble and the dizzying pace of a capitalist society. So he had this somewhat utopian vision of how people could live on the land and work the land in a self-sustaining, cooperative way, almost like, a bunch of co-ops along the AT, where people could combine their day-to-day work with their love of nature. I really see the benefit of this because my dad was someone who grew up in a rural area. And I know there are a lot of people who bring up the fact that a lot of farming practices are destructive and harmful to the land and to animals. I have a few farmers in my family, and all of them that I know love the outdoors. I'm not talking about big, giant industrial farming where they're spraying the crops with a bunch of cancer-causing Monsanto garbage. I'm talking about my brother-in-law, who is an urban farmer. He's from Wyoming, and he restores these plots of land and brings green spaces into the city. He would love to live rurally, but economically, it would be quite difficult. It's not really a possibility because if he lived rurally, there aren't enough people to buy his vegetables. So he's sort of forced to be in an urban environment in order to have enough of a market to sell people to. So I look at Benton MacKaye's model of all these little small towns along a trail. It kind of sounds like, I don't know, Willow or Lord of the Rings. It has a very Hobbit kind of feeling that I really liked, but sadly, I'm sure you know that's not what happened. The Appalachian Trail is not a bunch of the shires, but I still think it's pretty magical. In fact, I went to college right along the Appalachian Trail and completely took it for granted. I still remember in the summertime seeing hikers just walk along the road because you have to refuel and sometimes stay a night in a hotel or something. It's kind of weird because I think maybe I thought that doing the Appalachian Trail meant that it was almost like a vow of silence or something that a monk would do, where you're supposed to stay on the trail and forsake all the comforts of modern living. But it was fun to learn that in Bill Bryson's case, it was a fun outing to go off the trail and into whatever little town, and to hear the stories of people that he met at little lodges and hostels and restaurants. It really just sounded like a dream life to me, minus the ticks and bears and poisonous snakes and all of that kind of stuff. I know I'm such a wimp. In fact, that's one of the things you really get a sense for is the benefits of voluntary discomfort because of this thing called hedonic adaptation. Whatever luxuries you have start to become normal, like running water or an indoor toilet. Most of the people listening to this probably have that. You probably have access to indoor plumbing. But have you ever had your water shut off for whatever reason? Like there's a plumbing problem, so they shut off the water for a few hours? Or maybe you live in an area where if the power goes out, you also lose your indoor plumbing. All of a sudden, it's a huge deal that you can't wash your hands or go to the bathroom. I know the Stoics are very big into the idea of practicing poverty for the many benefits that it gives you, like a restored pleasure in ordinary things. I try to think of that every time I wash my hands, especially when it's cold outside and I can have warm tap water, and I just watch the water cascading over my knuckles and down my fingertips and stop and think about what a miracle it is that I have this, that I'm just a normal person. I didn't do anything special, and yet I have this machine where I pull a lever and instant warm water on my hands. That was one of the benefits I had going to camp as a kid. Mormons have a week-long summer camp for girls called, you guessed it, Girls Camp. And that hedonic adaptation was so interesting because the first day you're getting used to being outside in the humid Virginia summer and the bugs and the heat and just how sticky and yucky you feel. And then after a day or two, it starts to become the norm. And when you go into a building that has air conditioning, it's so exciting. Girls Camp is only a week long, but I remember how weird it felt to get in a car after not being in one for a few days. I really liked hearing about Bryson's little visits into the town and conversations he would have with people. It seems like a really great social experience, but it's in contrast to the fact that he's just been walking through the forest for 10 hours. So just like you appreciate the warm water, the flushable toilet, the air conditioning after being without it, your hunger and gratitude for human connection. I actually worked with a veterinarian who had a mug that said, "There's only one thing I love about people, their pets," or, something like that. But it's kind of this, middle finger, I hate people, they're the worst, leave me alone, don't talk to me, introvert for life. But maybe their problem is they just have too many people around. This is what Benton MacKaye was talking about. We need a break from late-stage capitalism, around-the-clock social feeds, constant media attention-seeking, advertising, etc. If there's anything that I would say I think could be improved about this book, would be more stories about conversations. There were quite a few, but I really loved hearing these little interactions that he had. I can't believe I'm this far into the podcast and I haven't mentioned. So Bill Bryson decides to do the AT, but he doesn't want to do it alone. And he put out in his Christmas card, "Hey, I'm going to do the Appalachian Trail if anybody wants to come with me." Crickets. Nobody wanted to. And then he gets this call from his friend that he calls Stephen Katz, although I've done my research on the internet. That's not his name. And he actually died in 2023. It's so sad. But yeah, Katz was a guy that he knew in high school and not the first person that you think would hike this massive trail, but he comes along with him. And Bryson and Katz are such a good matchup of yin and yang. Bryson is definitely the organized one. He's sensible, he's reliable. Katz has made some poor life choices that have landed him in prison and without driver's licenses and things like that. So they're a really fun mashup. And I think Katz's devil-may-care attitude is a fine compliment to Bryson's temperance and tenacity. For me, that is the dream, hiking with someone who is chill. When I went to hike the UK in my 20s, I had a Katz with me. I had my own version of Stephen Katz. It was my friend Robin, although Robin is very straight-laced. She wasn't like someone struggling with alcohol addiction or had any jail time under her belt. But like Katz, she was pretty chill, not needy at all, and one of those people that knows everyone has their own preferences and not to take offense when somebody prefers something that you don't. Does that make sense? Like, I remember when we went to Liverpool, she wanted to go to the Beatles Museum, and I wanted to walk the high street. And so we're just like, all right, I'll see you later. We'll meet back up at the bus at this time or whatever. And it was no big deal. Interestingly, Bryson, because he's in better shape than Katz and has packed less, is often far ahead of his friend. And it's fine. He would just get ahead and then at some point sit on a log and wait for Katz to catch up. Very sweetly, sometimes he would set down his pack, go back down the trail to see if he could find his friend. They have such an interesting friendship because it never gets super sentimental. It's sort of this, even if you leave grown men alone in the woods for months at a time, they still won't express their feelings. But there's a sweetness to their relationship. There's a part of me that likes the idea of doing it by myself and just being alone with my thoughts, but I think having a chill friend on the trail is an absolute boon. And honestly, a safety thing as well. Now, Bryson does talk about some of the deaths along the AT. A really scary one that happened actually while he was doing his hike in Shenandoah National Park. A couple other women who were shot, one survived, one did not. And then there were a few stories about hypothermia, because on some of these mountains, the weather is completely different at the top than the bottom. So you might start and it's 80 degrees and sunny and you're hot and you've got shorts. And eventually, as you're climbing, it gets colder, it gets windier. Maybe not necessarily snow, but wet rain that soaks your clothes. It's really pretty scary. There's a lot of stuff I didn't know about hypothermia. I just thought when you got hypothermia, you were like cold and shaking, and then everything kind of slowed down. And the way that you treat it is to take off your wet clothes and then to be bundled in something warm and dry. I didn't know the crazy stuff about how disorienting it is, and you kind of start losing your mind a little bit, like you can't tell where you are, you start making really rash decisions. And Bryson actually talks about an experience that he had on the trail, I think it was in Maine, as they were going up and it was snowing and really difficult, and just how irrational he was, and he could feel it in the time because he was hiking with his friend who said, "Hey, do you want to come this way? Hey, you doing all right, man?" And he was like, yeah, I'm fine. Instead of I'm going crazy. And then he shared the story about a guy named Robert Salinas who died of hypothermia on the trail. And it was something crazy, like he was only a few feet from a shelter or a tent and completely naked. That's late stage hypothermia. You like strip off all your clothes, so he's laying naked in the snow. Ugh, so crazy. That's why I'm so surprised how many people made it. One of my favorite people that Bryson mentioned in the book was William Bartram. Now, I know this name because I've been to Bartram Gardens, but I had no idea the incredible work that he did. Bartram was a Philadelphia Quaker. Shout out Philly, shout out Quakers. Y'all, I really need to go to a Quaker meeting. I have a feeling that Quakers might be one of the religious groups that actually have it figured out. They seem not to be hierarchical. They were always pacifists, abolitionists, equality, all these things. Quakers are probably my favorite group that I really don't know that much about, which is crazy because I live in the Quaker capital. Philadelphia is to Quakers like Salt Lake City is to Mormons. So if I want to meet some of the Quakeriest Quakers, their headquarters is a stone's throw from my front porch, and I have no excuse. Okay, so back to Bartram. My guy spent 4 years along the Appalachian Trail. Insane, by himself. But he was such a peaceful, loving, of the earth kind of guy. He made friends with the indigenous people who gave him some cute name like Flower Collector or Flower Man or something, because he was sent on this expedition by a wealthy botanist to collect specimens. That's what's so crazy to me. This guy was by himself. This is in the late 1700s. Sorry, I didn't mention that earlier. Yeah, 1700s. So they don't have Gore-Tex. They don't have lightweight anything. It's like heavy canvas stuff. And he's out here for 4 years and managed to collect over 350 plant species. He made a book that was the first list of all the North American birds. Living along the trail for 4 years by yourself collecting. Like how Did he just find some trees or something, gather some saplings, and then sort of try to find a road or some guy on a carriage and then, mail it? I don't even know how you would carry all this stuff with you. Or did he just take a leaf and press it and then give it some kind of name? I don't know, but I'm super fascinated. And now I'm going to read the book that he wrote called, very unpoetically, Travels Through North and South Carolina, Georgia, East and West Florida, by William Bartram. Okay, so he wasn't a poet, but I'll give him a pass because he lived without purse or script for 4 years and saw flora and fauna that no longer exist, that are extinct. He's probably one of the only Europeans that has seen the depth and breadth of American wildlife to the extent that he has. So shout out William Bartram. I'm not sure if I covered everything that you hoped that I would cover about a walk in the woods, but I would say one of the main things that I gained from it was feeling like I was riding alongside he and Katz, as Bryson did 870 miles of the AT, which is about 40%. In fact, I felt so inspired that I consented to a week-long camping trip at a place called, no, I'm not gonna tell you because I don't want this place to get as crowded as the AT is. No, that's selfish of me, because I think sharing stories like this inspires other people. I'm incredibly inspired by Grandma Gatewood. That is bonker balls to me that this lady, who's more than 25 years older than I am, hiked over 2,000 miles by herself with a shower curtain and a wool blanket and a pair of Keds. I liked hearing the stories about how we can turn things around. In fact, I probably wouldn't have found this book or read this book if I hadn't found Cal Newport's very scientific backing for the importance of reading. I got so scared when I read Johann Hari's book called Stolen Focus a few years ago, because it was so sobering to hear what is happening to our attention spans. How many people are no longer thriving, but just in a constant anxious state because of the lifestyle they're a part of. And I was so inspired by Hari's experience because he could feel that his attention was slipping and really wanted to get this book that he was writing finished. So he rented a little cottage on some island, I think in New York or New Jersey or Connecticut or something, some kind of resort place, but opted to not have any technology for 3 months other than a landline phone that if an emergency happened and somebody needed to call him, they could. But he left behind his laptop, anything that he had that would connect him to the internet. And his experience of unplugging from all of that was both inspirational and frustrating, because Johann Hari is a single man in his 30s and could just go off the grid for 3 months. I, as the mother of 3 children, find it much more difficult to go, okay, that's it. We're not going to have any internet or anything for 3 months. It would probably be considered child abuse or kind of culty or something. And I get that. There are so many things that I really want to do that I can't really impose on the people in my life. So I felt frustrated when I read about Hari's experience, because he talked about how he would go for these, I know it sounds cliche to say long walks on the beach, but literally walking along the beach for hours, letting his mind completely wander. He said he could remember things, he could read faster, his dreams were more vivid, he slept more deeply. I think he said he didn't even feel like he needed coffee. Like he was just so restful and re-energized. And as I read this book, I'm like, oh, I want to do that so bad. Oh, as a person of extremes, I want that deprivation. I want that reset. And so bringing it back to Cal Newport, I felt like I was given a middle way, that I saw what Johann Hari did and I thought, oh, that's what I want. That's what I want. I want to strip myself of all of the shackles of modernity and just go back to the very basics. And Cal Newport is like, actually, you can start to reclaim your attention just by reading a lot more. Just by plugging in your phone and not carrying it with you. Just by going on walks without anything to listen to. A phone-free walk where you're not checking anything. I suppose it's a case for incrementalism. Even though I really love the high that you get from depriving yourself of certain luxuries, I'm doing my best to ban what I would call the things that deplete my attention ozone layer. Just like the things that we can do can actively heal nature and make humanity better, there are little things that I can do to heal my own attention span, my own ability to connect, and to sort of microdose this solitude that ended up being a massive reset for Bill Bryson, for Johann Hari, and Grandma Gatewood. By the way, I don't know if I mentioned, but Grandma Gatewood did the AT 3 times. She was the first woman to do the whole AT, but then returned 2 more times, which is a reminder that this effort to somewhat reclaim your sovereignty isn't a once and done, but more of a rinse and repeat. I'm really glad that I read this book and especially did some research on the back end of it to see that things can get better and they can get worse, that we have a lot more autonomy than we think we do, that we can push ourselves to boundaries that maybe we would have thought impossible. Since you've made it to the end, I hope that you've enjoyed this. If you want to recommend any books to me, I'd be happy for book recommendations. Part of me wants to follow along this Appalachian Trail of books, but I'm eager to go somewhere else. France, Spain, and Portugal, to be specific, because that's what I found is so magical about these books. That's what I loved about it. Even though reading the book, I was in a little row home in Philadelphia on a hot summer day. I love the transporting power of books. Rather than feeling resentful that I tried to move my family to Europe and we lived there for 6 months and then they shot me down and then I was forced to come back to the States. That really doesn't matter because I can go anywhere I want in my imagination, and books are a beautiful way of doing it. Free, simple way to be somewhere else. I don't know if this inflation stuff or fuel prices are ever going to level out, so that's why reading a book is an eco-friendly way with a very small carbon footprint for me to get to go anywhere I want in the world and not have to get buy-in from any of my family members. This is my little tiny rebellious way of going anywhere I want. And when I say thank you for listening, I really mean it. These podcasts take a long time to make, and it's sort of an experimental thing that I'm just testing out. So the fact that you took a chance on this is actually quite sweet to me. I hope you're reading a really good book right now. I hope you can get lost in a book like I got lost in a walk in the woods with Bill Bryson.
Thank you for listening to the Leah Renee podcast. If you'd like to help me grow the old-fashioned way, but without having to bow to the likes of social media, visit my website, leahrenee.co. And as always,
Go to bed early, you doofus.